All right. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to day 4 of the Iowa Ideas Water Quality In-Depth Week. Today, we've got a panel discussion titled In Volumes, the Impact of Animal Waste, with a fantastic lineup of panelists. Before we introduce our panelists, we have a message from our event sponsor, Hertz Farm Management.
Hi folks, I'm Ryan Kay with Hertz Farm Management out of our Mount Vernon, Iowa office. I'm a farm manager. We are happy to sponsor the Iowa Idea Water Quality Week. Water is a valuable resource that agriculture plays an important role in managing. I'm excited to be on the panel this week looking into the impacts of animal waste on water quality. We have been helping landowners protect streams, rivers, and lakes over Hertz's 75 years in business. If you have any questions or just like to talk about water quality in agriculture, please feel free to reach out to our office at 319-895-8858 or visit hertz.ag. Thank you.
Whoa, Ryan, this is blowing my mind. You were on that video, and then here you are with us on the Zoom.
Yeah, I made sure I put a different shirt on for you, Aaron.
Well, why don't you get us started, introduce yourself, and tell us a little bit about your connection to the topic today.
Yeah, well, thanks, Aaron, for allowing me on the topic here. I grew up in Western Iowa on a livestock crop farm. We raised hogs and cattle, and I'm just going to tell you, I got a little experience with hauling manure. We still have our farm in Western Iowa, and I still help out there quite a bit. In my current role, I work for Hertz Farm Management. I manage farms for clients that are absentee landowners out of state and for landowners that are in the state too, or maybe even live on the farm. But we work with a lot of different neighboring farms and farmers to apply manure in an efficient way to try to spread it out, not just on the same fields year after year. We have manure on farms that we manage, that we work with adjoining landowners to put it on. And then we acquire manure from other facilities to put it on land that we manage currently. So I went to Iowa State University undergrad a few years ago and got my master's there as well. So I love working in agriculture in Iowa.
That's great. Bob, do you want to go next?
Sure, if you'd like. I've been in the agribusiness sector, I guess, in agriculture for about 45 years. I have my own business, Riley Resource Group, which is a collection of ag-related companies. And our primary driver there is the energy that is fed to animals is the product that we make. And whether you want more or bigger eggs out of a layer, or you want better reproduction out of a swine herd, or you want to have more efficient rate of gain for these animals, that's our business. We're also involved in the corn oil refining business, which comes from ethanol plants. So we're trying to move some of the corn oil into edible channels or renewable energy products. I've done a lot of nonprofit work throughout all my years, and some of it has been within the industry. For instance, I'm still on the board of the Iowa Poultry Association, and I've been on various committees of the American Feed Industry Association. But I also have an abiding interest in what's going on in the environment, and I'm currently on the Nature Conservancy Board of Iowa and have been on the Iowa Environmental Council Board, currently on the White Rock Conservancy Board, and even spent 6 or 7 years on the Des Moines Waterworks Board. So I am bridging always the seeming wide gap between agriculture and conservation, because I think that they are married and need to be cheek to jowl at every opportunity they can. So that's my background.
Thank you. Matt, would you go next?
Sure. I'm Matt Liebman at Iowa State University. I'm a professor of agronomy. I've worked as an agronomist for the last 35 years here in Iowa since 1998, and before that in Maine, and before that in California. My research and teaching and outreach efforts are directed at ways to maintain farm productivity and profitability while better protecting the environment. And I've worked on a variety of large-scale, long-term cropping systems experiments that have included considerations of soil health and water quality and profitability and impacts on wildlife. I'm a member of the STRIPS team that's been using conservation buffers made of prairie vegetation woven into cropland to support Iowa wildlife and to protect soil and water quality. So I'm pleased to be with you here today, and I'm excited by the opportunity to participate in this conversation.
Thank you. And Steve?
Yes, I worked at Iowa State University for 42 years. I managed the chemical research instrumentation facility. So my background, of course, is chemistry. I have been a water quality advocate for more than a quarter century. I've been involved with a number of different organizations in assisting water quality efforts, sometimes efforts devoted to achieving better rules and or legislation, sometimes efforts devoted to litigation to try to force the state to properly implement aspects of the Federal Clean Water Act. I have had some involvement with CAFO in the CAFO area, starting more than 25 years ago when we negotiated a settlement with the CAFO that was located in the watershed of the state's most important trout stream, French Creek, at the time. And I have been involved, as I said, in helping the state develop water quality standards more consistent with the Federal Clean Water Act. As an environmentalist, we sometimes have accomplishments, sometimes not. And one of the accomplishments was as part of an anti-degradation lawsuit against EPA. We were able to achieve better rules in Iowa to protect water quality from degradation. And as part of that, establish a category of waters called outstanding Iowa waters, which are deserving of special protection. So I'm still involved in water quality issues and still at the moment involved in some CAFO issues.
Thank you. I wanted to just lay the groundwork here with more than 8 pigs to each person in Iowa, not to mention cattle and poultry. Animal production is obviously a major part of Iowa's economy, but with those animals comes their manure, and disposing of manure can become a major environmental challenge, especially for water quality. But let's talk first about manure. It is a great natural fertilizer that's been used that way for a long time. I wanted to just throw this out to the panel at large. How does livestock and poultry manure contribute to the sustainability of farming systems?
Well, I could start in on that by saying that, for one thing, we use poultry and swine and other livestock manures to basically cover about 23 to 25% of our nutrient needs for the 23 million crop acres that we have of corn and soybeans. And so in my mind, any issues that we have with manure is not so much an amount as it is a dislocation. If we put too much manure in one place, it's like anything. If I drink too much milk, I'm sure I'd get sick if I tried to drink a gallon at a time. But if I space it out over time and over space, then I think I can properly manage that better if we have the right rules and and kind of rules of the road to make sure that we don't over apply and that we put it in the right place. But if we are interested in soil health in any way, shape, or form, which to me is our number one infrastructure in Iowa, is the soil that we have. If we're interested in soil health, then it's essential that we replenish the nutrients that we are taking out of that soil and replace them and even enhance that so that we can have regenerative agriculture. And that's what will make Iowa what it used to be, make it great again. So.
Yeah, I guess I can go follow with Bob, and I agree with what he said about it's critical. I mean, if you look at our organic production in our state of crops, they specifically require manure of some type to use as their sole source of fertilizer, pretty much. So it's critical that we have that as a resource for those situations. But I mean, to me, if you want to talk about soil health, if you utilize manure correctly, I mean, that's one of the best things that you can do for soil health. Build the organic matter, build the water holding capacity of it. It works great with cover crops. It's just so many positives there, but the key is that we're getting concentrated with some of these facilities, and we just got to get it spread out more evenly to some of the fields and make sure we're putting it on land and soils that can hold that manure. Certain soil types are more leachable than other soil types, so you just want to make sure you get it on the right field.
You don't all have to comment on each question, but Matt or Steve, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Sure. It's important to understand that as useful as manure is, it's not the sole source of nutrients in Iowa. Obviously, we use a tremendous amount of fertilizer here, as well as we gain significant amounts of nitrogen, about 1 billion pounds a year, from biological nitrogen fixation on the roots of crops like soybean and alfalfa and clover. So when we begin to approach nutrient management, we need to look at all the inputs to our cropland to better manage the total that's being delivered in a manner that matches crop uptake, right? So we want to know the amounts that are removed by crops, and we want to make sure that the amounts delivered are not in excess of what the crop absorption capacity is. We also want to know that those nutrients are being delivered at a time of year when crop roots can make use of them. We have a situation here in Iowa where the dominant crops are only actively growing for about 4 months a year, whereas we can lose nutrients from soils for many more months a year through leaching or runoff. So we want to make sure that the delivery of the nutrients matches the ability of the crops to take up those nutrients and not create excesses at times of year when nutrients can be lost to leaching and runoff.
My perspective on the use of manure, of course, is a wonderful fertilizer when it's applied correctly and used correctly. And each of the panelists who have expressed the benefits of manure have each presented caveats with their statements. If it's applied correctly, if it's not over applied, if it's not too concentrated. So there are lots of reasons why reasonable people might not want more hog confinements or huge cattle operations in Iowa. That's not what this forum is about. But from the perspective of manure, the current production system, corn, soybeans, and CAFOs, has led to a situation where the manure often is not applied agronomically. It's not applied responsively. It's applied on frozen, snow-covered ground. It's applied on highly erodible land. It's over-applied based upon the agronomic crop uptake. So while recognizing the benefits of manure, and I certainly defer to Matt in that area, I have been and continue to be concerned about how the application of manure is regulated and how it is in actuality being done on our sensitive areas of Iowa.
Fair point, Steve. And just wanted to let our audience know we have about 40 people participating here. If you have questions, submit them in the chat and we'll try to work some of them into our conversation here. But in the meantime, a 2019 study by the University of Iowa showed farmers in two Northwest Iowa watersheds were applying fertilizer, both manure and commercial fertilizer, at more than double the recommended rates. And that's reflected in the higher nitrate levels in the Missouri River. So to Steve's point, what are some things we could do to kind of reduce or eliminate that over application?
Well, at a real basic level, you build a nutrient budget that's realistic, balancing inputs with crop uptake. And based on the USDA figures I've seen for some counties in Northwest Iowa, the amount of nitrogen going in through fertilizer, manure, and biological nitrogen fixation is 50 to 60% greater than can be taken up by the corn and soybean crops. So that's a recipe for excess nitrogen on the land, which is susceptible to loss. And if you get conditions of topography or weather that move nitrogen and phosphorus into surface water, you wind up with big problems downstream. So I would say, the first place to start is with realistic nutrient budgeting. And we all believe that farmers as managers of businesses should be looking out for over application of nitrogen for financial reasons. But the reality is, when we look at the figures of fertilizer application, manure nutrient application, and biological nitrogen fixation, that's not happening in some places. Other places are much more in line. But as you mentioned, there are areas in Iowa where that is not, where nutrient inputs are not in balance with crop uptake.
Are there things that the state should be doing to require those realistic nutrient budgets or parameters that need to be put in place?
My opinion is that we need to come to some common agreements about public health and safety. If you fly on an airplane, you expect that air traffic control coordinates the movement of airplanes in and out of airports in such a manner that we all benefit from those common agreements. So I don't think it's too much to ask that we come to some common agreements about nutrient management.
Some of the things that I have been reading about as I prepared for this panel, because I typically work on water quality standards, but some of the steps that it seems, even within the current production model of corn, soybeans, and CAFOs, we could take steps like banning row crop agriculture in the 2-year floodplain. 400,000 acres are in that category where pesticides and fertilizers get washed away repeatedly. We could ban fall tillage, which is universally recognized to have a disproportionately bad environmental impact. We could ban manure on snow and frozen ground, no exceptions. We could make farmers adhere to ISU fertilization guidelines, as Matt has discussed. And we could reformulate CAFO regulations. Currently, the master matrix is an inadequate tool, especially when you're considering the watershed effects of confinement operation locations. So there's a number of steps we could take within the current production model that would result in considerable improvements to water quality if we reached agreements to actually do those things.
So currently the Iowa DNR requires a manure management plan, and they go through a lot of what Matt has referred to as what the crop crop needs are, and you can apply over what the crop needs have been. But it does not clarify it. You have to show exact locations where you're putting the manure on. But it doesn't go into some of the guidelines on what soil types there are, how close it is to any water sources, that information like that, that I think we probably need to have more areas that are protected either by wetlands, filter strips, and that information to try to me, we've tried to do the broad scope of soil health and items, and it works in certain areas, but we need to find these areas that it really is point source connected, where we really can quantify these actions and how it's gonna give us a better return on investment if we do things like that, rather than just try to do, you can't do fall tillage or something like that. I mean, if we can identify these areas and concentrate on it, I think that's a little bit more manageable than trying to look at the whole scope.
Well, and as we see this whole thing as a system, and again, I think Matt has done a very good job of showing how much comes from the air, how much nitrogen is fixed from there, how much comes from manure, how much comes from commercial fertilizer, how much comes from crop residue. We can see that this whole system is very complex. And I think that they tried to address that with the Iowa nutrient reduction suggestion that Iowa State and a few other agencies put out. But as far as the, I guess I'm going to say the adoption of these, it's like our cover crops. We have about 750 or 800,000 acres of cover crops of the 23 million crop acres that we have. Well, that's completely unacceptable when we are thinking about systems work and how that all fits together. We have that inability of the DNR to really monitor and audit these manure management plans because the legislature has cut the funding to DNR to make sure that they don't have that capacity for enforcement and for regulatory rigor that's necessary. So we know what needs to be done, but I don't think we have the political will to get that done. And I think that comes to some of the things that Steve is talking about. What is our responsibility to the citizens of Iowa as an agricultural community? And how can we be the beacon for good agricultural practices throughout the world? Because people look at Iowa and say, well, whatever they do there is good enough for us because they're the #1 producer. We've got to do a much more exceptional job to get that done.
So a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. One is a question, why do the panelists think farmers as cost-conscious business people would over-apply manure fertilizer? And then another question, kind of a companion to that, is this listener is saying that he hears Matt saying that farmers need to trust the recommendations for nutrient levels and not over-apply additional fertilizers. Matt, I don't know, or Matt or Ryan, if you could speak to why farmers might apply commercial fertilizers on top of manure, maybe because they just aren't confident about those recommendations, or why do they do that?
Well, I guess I can start, Matt, and then I'll let you follow it up. But manure is a great resource for fertilizer. However, it is not consistent like our commercial fertilizers are. There's more variability to it. It's a highly water concentrated source, and the manure nutrients in it vary. So usually how they look at things is they'll sample the manure, and that'll give you a baseline. But usually, that's used as a minimum. That's not, the crop needs more than that. So then they substitute some commercial fertilizer with the manure to make sure the crop has what it needs. I'm not aware of anybody that goes out there and just applies manure just to put excess on there. Not that I'm aware of. I'm sure it may or may not happen, but those are not facts that I can state or not state. But statistics and research shows that if you use manure as a source, as manure as a fertilizer, if you use it 2/3 of a rate or 3/4 of a rate instead of the whole rate, and then apply commercial fertilizer in there, that's where we're seeing the yield gains of over 10%. Versus if we just use manure versus commercial fertilizer, it may give us 3 to 6% increase in yields. So it's one of those things where it's not as consistent of quality of a nutrient. So we need to utilize it as a baseline and maybe not apply as much per acre, and then put some commercial fertilizer in there with it to help, make sure we're not above those levels of the crop needs.
So
If I could speak, I'm sorry, go ahead, Matt.
I agree with Ryan that there are synergistic effects of manure and fertilizer when used together judiciously. I don't know the motivations for individuals to apply more nutrients than the crop needs, other than fertilizer can be relatively inexpensive relative to the value of the crop you get when you maximize your crop yield, but that's not the economically best point on that yield response curve. What we do know is that when we look at the amounts of fertilizer that are sold and the amounts of manure generated by animals and the amounts of nitrogen fixed through biological processes, there are areas of Iowa where there are substantial excess quantities of nitrogen and phosphorus being deposited on the land. Typically, when you haul manure, there's a distance beyond which you don't want to go because it takes more time and it takes more money. So you can wind up with concentrations of manure nutrients closer to animal facilities than distributed across all the farms the farmer may be working with. So that's one issue. I want to make one other point, which is that there are technologies available, and I'm familiar with them through experience, where you can apply a certain amount of fertilizer and manure early in the season or preceding the planting of a corn crop, and then you can monitor the status of nutrients in the soil and add additional nitrogen through side dressing at a time when the crop is about 6 to 12 inches tall. That doesn't work for every farm. It doesn't work for every year with weather patterns that may interfere with getting machinery into the field, but it is a way to reduce the amount of nitrogen applied by about 30% with no impact on yield.
Getting back to the issue of why would farmers over apply nutrients? Well, and I'm an outsider looking in. You folks are in this business, you're professionals in this business. I'm just a water quality advocate. Over applying nutrients is kind of the ultimate crop insurance. The farmer may be getting mixed signals from Iowa State University, from the supplier of commercial fertilizer, and over applying. And we know that about 16% of all the nitrogen that's put on the fields is just being washed away into our streams. We're losing over 16% of all the nitrogen we put on there. And the other issue about the manure that I want to stress, because I know we are limited in time, is this issue of applying manure at the nitrogen agronomic rate for crops, which is what DNR allows and in their manure management plans. And when you do that, you're over applying phosphorus by about a factor of ×3 or even greater. And that phosphorus is building up in the soil, and it will leach off those fields attached to soil particles whenever it rains. In the Iowa Code, there's a recommendation which follows Iowa State recommendation that where the phosphorus test value is in the optimum range, or that you not apply any additional phosphorus from manure or other sources where you already have optimum levels. And yet in all the manure management plans I've reviewed and all the different fields I've looked at and all the Russell II calculations and P-index calculations, invariably the P-test is always in the high or very high range. And yet DNR is allowing, against the advice that's in the Iowa Code, farmers to spread the manure at the nitrogen agronomic rate and over apply phosphorus. And this is in my opinion, as a water quality advocate, is a leading cause of impairments to our streams, especially when applied to highly erodible land. which is many of the manure plans I've studied are located in areas of Northeast Iowa, which is highly erodible land. And we're simply over applying the manure in terms of the phosphorus levels that are in the manure.
One of the ideas that was presented by Larry Weber, he was our keynote speaker on Monday for the Water Quality In-Depth Week, University of Iowa professor, was indemnifying yield loss for farmers who prove that they have applied the correct amount of nitrogen and phosphorus. What do you guys think of that idea?
Well, I'll speak up again, and I will just say what this person is advocating is some way for the public to subsidize industry in order to not degrade a natural resource that's in common trust. In other words, clean water. So for many years, I've always and been very vocal at expressing that from my perspective, clean water belongs to me. Water quality belongs to me. And anything you do, whether it's a city, an industry, or a farm that degrades water quality is stealing from me. And I don't particularly like when you do that, and I'm not particularly fond of paying you to stop stealing from me. So that's the hardcore left-wing tree-hugging position, but sometimes I find myself there.
Well, I think there's many avenues that can be utilized in terms of ecosystem services and payment for those services to landowners or farmers to see if we can improve our systems. And it can start with carbon, which everyone on this call probably knows. There's a lot of activity going along now and conversation about how can we sequester carbon and what is the role of agriculture in that. And I think that's probably a very high or easy low-hanging fruit. But there are other ecosystem services that I think we can provide that are separate from, I'll call it row crop and or manure management agriculture that can be utilized to benefit society. That is not so much, as Steve says, a pay not to pollute, but is a payment to provide those services to downstream customers that are interested in having these. So whether it be carbon sequestration or soil health indexes that can be continually brought up so that we kind of separate out the concept of private ownership of land and public good for having good, healthy land. One of my big things is I want my great-great-great-grandchildren to have some ability to provide food for themselves because we will have preserved their soil health that they inherit from multiple generations that in the current trajectory is going in the wrong way. We've lost 50% of our carbon content in Iowa soils, and our soil health is pretty bad. So my sense is this is a common good that we need to subjugate self-interest to.
Matt or Ryan, do you have any thoughts about the idea of indemnifying yield loss for people who can confirm they aren't over applying?
I think it's really difficult to identify sources of yield loss. I mean, the fact that you get a lower yield this year than you did last year could be due to a lot of things other than just managing nutrients. So I'm a little bit skeptical of how that would work. Currently, farmers have access to insurance that taxpayers subsidize at the rate of like 60 to 70% of the cost. So, we're already doing quite a bit to support the farm sector. And over the last several years, large quantities of money, tens of billions of dollars have moved towards the farm sector. So I'm not sure that that's really paying people to cover yield loss that they attribute to inadequate amounts of nutrient application. I'm not sure is going to be a good solution. I think one of the things to understand about Iowa's failure to make a lot of progress with regard to water quality is that we're all in this together, in the sense that if you lose 15 to 25 pounds of nitrogen for every acre of corn and soybean in Iowa, that doesn't sound like a lot relative to the amount of nutrients that farmers are managing on a per acre basis. But when you multiply 15 to 25 pounds of nutrient loss by 23 million acres, that adds up to a lot of nutrients, okay? So in 2019, just shy of 1 billion pounds of nitrogen went down the streams and rivers of Iowa. That wasn't any one farmer's egregious mistake necessarily. That was all of us together supporting an agricultural system that's very leaky, in the sense that every field typically loses some, okay? In some years, on some fields, you might lose a lot or nothing, but collectively, we're in this together with an enterprise that dominates most of our landscape that's bleeding nutrients. So I would say that we need to come to some common agreements about what practices that protect water quality should be, and then develop the legislation and the guidance, and in some cases, the incentives to help people get there. And that's not happening. Since the start of the Iowa reduction strategy in 2013, the amount of nitrogen going down waterways in Iowa has increased about 35%. That trend is up. So we need to do something different.
Yeah, I would agree with Matt. There's no easy button here. I mean, this is going to take all hands on deck. We're going to have to do it all together. We're definitely looking at, we mentioned earlier that we have a crop that's alive for 3 to 5 months out of the year. And so we need to have more living organisms out there holding the nutrients for us when we need it. I always was told by somebody a long time ago, it's kind of hard to feed a crop pretty much at Thanksgiving, the year before it needs it, by next August. There's 9 months we're feeding it out there, and it's open to the environment that could put it in our water. It could move it anywhere. It could go straight up in the air. It could go down. So, I mean, the closer we get to applying our nutrients when the crop needs it, and that's difficult because we're talking about manure that's very heavy. It causes compaction. There's very limited, I mean, the equipment to apply it is very expensive to have compared to what we had 30 years ago. But we are coming up with new technologies that will be able to get it on when we need it closer, but we just don't have those resources right now at our fingertips. So if we can get this manure put on before the crop needs it, right before the crop needs it, not 9 months before it, or if it gets put on a little bit earlier, maybe we should have a cover crop there to help hold it from either eroding or utilize it until it degrades. And again, but it's that whole ecosystem approach. We got to look at soil types. I mean, we got to look at everything. Where are confinements, where the manure is located? We need to have a larger area for that to get spread out so we don't maximize those P levels. It's just a lot of different avenues here. And I don't want to say it's really complicated. We can't fix it. We can. We just have to do it.
So with climate change, we've had more frequent floods and some pretty damaging floods. And there was, I think, a voluntary land buyout project after the floods in Western Iowa after 2019. And so many farmers spoke up and said, yes, we're willing to take this land out of production, that there wasn't enough money for all that. I'm wondering, Steve proposed banning growing row crops in the 2-year floodplain. Maybe there's potential for buyouts of crops in those areas. What does the panel think about trying to get crops out of those low-lying flood-prone areas?
I think that's an excellent idea, and I think our crop insurance is set up to basically be taken advantage of. People racing to get their crops into that 2-year floodplain at a particular date, so they can make sure that they get their remuneration should it flood, and the likelihood of that is pretty high. So we have a little bit of gaming of the system that's going on there, and I think with the current USDA attitude about that there's probably a higher likelihood that those types of sensitive acres could be retired, or we could pull back from a crop insurance system on that to allow the market to determine that instead of the government.
Following up on what Bob had talked about earlier about carbon sequestration, I certainly can see win-win where acres that are only periodically productive in row crops can be put into perennial plantings and credits given for carbon sequestration. What I don't really, not really in favor of is paying farmers for carbon sequestration on row crops that they're cropping. From my perspective, carbon sequestration is an added bonus and it needs to be in place of row crops. The nutrient reduction strategy that was enforced in 2013 relies on voluntary implementation. I won't say voluntary compliance because there are no rules, so you cannot voluntarily or involuntarily comply. But since 2013, there's been a 46% increase using the 5-year running average, 46% increase in nitrate leaching from all the watersheds in Iowa collectively. And so clearly this voluntary approach, it is not working, and no offense to farmers, it hasn't worked for the 20 or 30 years that it's been promoted as the way that we'll get to clean water. So unless we are able to collectively decide upon some good practices that are required, perhaps incentivized, but required, we're really not going to achieve water quality, and we're going to continue to have a problem with the over application and misapplication of manure and other nutrients.
I wanted to shift gears just a little bit to another way that large animal feeding operations are disposing of manure, and those are on-farm anaerobic digesters. The Iowa legislature approved a bill this session that makes anaerobic digesters, gives them the opportunity to be used at animal feeding operations instead of like an open pit, open manure pit. And some people are concerned this is going to maybe lead to an expansion of large scale animal production because of the digesters, but they're very expensive. They also take very delicate chemistry to make sure that the all your microbes and stuff are working to break down the material inside those. I just wondered whether the panel thinks we're going to see expansion, we're going to see more digesters, and whether you think that's a good technology for disposing of waste in this way.
Well, first, it doesn't dispose of the waste. It extracts methane gas from the components that are going in. And there can be a variety of components that go in to balance the, quote, diet of the anaerobic digester. Those things are much like a rumen. They require a certain amount of chemistry and biology to go on inside to perform correctly, but so it will extract the methane from that, and that can be turned around and sold as a fuel, renewable fuel. And then the material that comes out of the other end of the digester, less the methane gas, still ends up being about the same volume that went in on the front side. So the anaerobic digestion merely allows you to remove a component, and then other the other components go on to the field.
As someone my background is chemistry, and I've studied the methane energy system, and I'm opposed to using anaerobic digesters to produce methane in that fashion for several reasons. First of all, the process doesn't extract methane from these organic materials. It converts perfectly good organic material into methane plus other products. My main concern is methane is a terrible greenhouse gas. Methane on a 100-year time frame is 25 times worse than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. But gases decay at different rates in the atmosphere. And so when you look on a 20-year time frame, methane is 75 times worse than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. And these anaerobic digesters are leaky systems at best. And I know several in Iowa, and one of them in Iowa says, well, I'm not even capturing my methane. I'm just using this for odor reduction technology. So that methane is just going up into the atmosphere, working as a greenhouse gas. So, and even if we took most of the manure produced in the US and converted to methane, that would only account for about 5% of the annual use of methane in the United States. Our methane comes from fracking. That's where it comes from. And putting in methane digesters is not going to contribute to some renewable energy source for methane. First of all, methane is a terrible thing to be using energy for because it is such a terrible greenhouse gas. So while there may be a short-term economic benefit to some people in Iowa to put in methane digesters, it will cause CAFOs to get larger and more concentrated because all that manure has to come from somewhere, and you can't truck it very far economically. So I see this as a technology that it was worth investigating, but because of the effects on global climate change, it's just not a pathway that we should be investing significant technological and financial resources in going down that path. There are other pathways we can go down that I think will be a lot more beneficial to Iowans than promoting methane digesters and larger and more concentrated grouping of confinements.
Brian or Matt?
I pretty much agree. I know several of them exist and they've struggled with the technology. There's a big increase in cost to get it set up, and it's very expensive to maintain. So it may work, but I don't think large scale. I don't think it'll work in Iowa.
I would agree that it's a technology that has some drawbacks and it has some potentials. The question is, over the longer term, what is the value of the methane that's going to be generated? So much of what's going on now with renewable natural gas is linked to premium payments from the California market, which are very attractive and have made the technology more feasible. I guess I need to know more about how long those price premiums will continue to exist. And if farmers make the investment, can they recoup the investment on these types of digesters over the longer term? And if more people get into the market nationally or in California, what does that mean for price stability?
Again, I want to change gears. We're winding down here. Our hour is going away fast, but a question from an audience member asking the panel to speak to environmental justice questions related to animal feeding operations. Are disadvantaged, marginalized communities, communities of color, perhaps bearing a disproportionate share of the pollution costs and just the unpleasantness?
Well, we know from the worst period of COVID-19 infections that people of color working in processing plants suffered disproportionately high levels of illness and death. So yes, there are important issues with regard to impacts of working close together in animal processing facilities.
And maybe also where facilities are sited. Do you see any of that going on in Iowa?
Well, there are communities that are very diverse surrounding meatpacking plants. If you go up to Storm Lake, you'll find very many different languages spoken in the grade school. And that's because jobs in those meatpacking plants have allowed people newly arrived in the United States to work in these facilities. So there are opportunities for employment. The question is, are the damages suffered through diseases like COVID-19 or occupational safety and health considerations borne disproportionately by those communities?
Well, and I think to add to that, as you take the whole system, and I'm talking about the whole system, Iowa has the most photosynthetically active geography in the globe during the growing season, and we need to convert as much of this thermonuclear activity to biomass, and then with that, bringing in regenerative agriculture that supplies the nutrients back to our soils. So that's the natural component of that. And we start to throw in the human component of that and the cultural component of that and the distribution of all these materials, animals, people, and labor in this watershed that we have between the two rivers. It's necessary for us to distribute those more equitably and to make sure that the concentration is such that it doesn't give us negative outcomes on any of those fronts.
One more question I have today here. There are folks in the state, including Larry Weber mentioned it, others have, to ask for a moratorium on new large-scale animal feeding operations until we can show a reduction in nitrate levels in our rivers and streams. What does the panel think about that?
Well, it's a question on where are these levels coming from? You know, I mean, we've been testing historically, not nearly as much as what we have the last 10 to 20 years. We need to make sure we pinpoint exactly, is this coming from commercial? Is it coming from ag? I believe it's coming from everywhere. I believe it's a natural thing that is created by the weather that we have. Some years we have a ton of rain and water that flush out these nutrients, that we have more erosion. On a dry year like this, and you drive over rivers and streams and see very little water running, you know, we don't have much erosion. But I mean, we do need to collectively look at everyone to try to do this. I am pretty concerned when we pinpoint one area. We need to look at everybody.
As a scientist, I've reviewed some of this literature. As I say, I mostly work on water quality standards issues, but when you look at 5-year running averages of nitrate levels by watershed, it correlates extremely closely with the application of manure, with the concentration of confinements. There's a strong correlation when you look at 5-year running averages, not a single year, Matt, 5-year running averages. It correlates well. So the Floyd River, the Floyd watershed is huge in terms of nitrate loss, and it's huge in terms of concentration of confinements. Another area is Northeast Iowa, where if you look at simply the nitrate concentrations in the rivers and streams, it's the highest in the state. And you ask yourself why, because although there are confinements up there, they're not as concentrated as other areas. And it's because the soil is only a foot thick, and then nitrate is water soluble and it leaches through the soil into the porous bedrock, the limestone and dolomite and fractured limestone and karst features right below the soil. And that's a direct conduit into the streams. And so that's why we have high nitrate levels in streams in Northeast Iowa. And that's and the reason we have high nitrate levels in Northwest Iowa is because of the concentration of confinements. At least that's what the data seems to show. And we don't seem to have any policies or regulations that effectively address these realities when we're citing or approving manure management plans. That's a huge concern.
I would say that I think we need to develop a regulatory approach that functions on a watershed basis. And some of that will take into account the soil and geological factors. Some of it will take into account the existing number of animal units and fertilizer recommendations. And then we can begin to develop for a drainage basin a realistic way of developing nutrient balance to maintain crop productivity without exceeding the amount of nutrients supplied necessary to support that productivity. But I don't think it's the kind of issue that can be resolved on an individual farm basis. I think it needs to take a watershed approach.
I agree with Matt that we need a functional plan and the political will to implement that plan. Giving a timeout to a particular industry or a particular farmer, I don't think does what we need to do, because without that political will to solve in the meantime what it is we're trying to get done, all we're doing is putting off the inevitable and trying to penalize somebody. But I don't think that's the right approach. I think the approach is what Matt said. Let's get it onto a watershed basis, whether that's a Huck 8, a Huck 10 or 12 or even 14, get down to as granular an operation as we can, make sure that the drainage is set up the right way, make sure that the wetlands are set up the right way, the buffers are set up the right way, and the agronomic practices that we put into that watershed are well documented and well managed. That way we can get something done across the state.
I'm hearing phrases of functional plan, regulatory approach, political will. It sounds like we need some lawmakers to listen up here and take some action along this front.
I'll go back to the comment I made about air traffic control. Would you go to the airport and get on an airplane knowing that there was nobody directing traffic? I wouldn't. I'm not going to take that chance. So I would say, from the standpoint of protecting the public health and safety related to water quality, we have to come to some common agreements.
Yes, the economic and political system that is set up now is set up to maximize agricultural profitability. It's not set up to maximize environmental sustainability or even to regenerate ag to get us back to where we were 50 or 100 years ago. So we need to fix that system.
Yes, I think we're going to have to leave it there, but I guess I feel like there's a little bit of a call to arms here, an action, a little bit of hopefully we'll charge up some of the lawmakers and others to implement some of these changes that might be needed. Thank you so much to our audience questions that we got here today. And thanks obviously to our wonderful panel. We have Matt Liebman, the Wallace Chair for Sustainable Ag and Agronomy Professor at Iowa State, Bob Riley with the Riley Resource Group and Chairman Emeritus at Feed Energy Company, Steve Vasey, a retired Iowa State University employee and water quality advocate, and Ryan Kay, a farm manager at Hertz Farm Management. So thank you so much for your participation today and have a great rest of your week.